to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, we're celebrating the 100th episode of Glenview TV's Off the Shelf program. Off the Shelf, Around the World in 100 Episodes, is a snapshot of our many memorable guests and their stories. Since inheriting the program from Martha Kofel in 2013, I've enjoyed meeting our neighborhood authors and hearing their stories. After moving here from Los Angeles in 2011, I learned so much from these authors about Glenview heritage. Dan WASSMANN, who wrote Tall Trees and Illustrated History, told us about Swain Nelson's nursery business.
There was a guy named, a Swedish emigre named Swain Nelson,
Yes.
who in 1892 bought a bunch of land in Glenview to start a landscape nursery. And he was a very prominent landscape architect, landscape contractor. And so he would
He had a big business.
He had a big business, and he would sell trees for developments all around the Chicago area.
Yes.
Lincoln Park, the Century of Progress, the World's Fair, cemeteries, big estates. He would sell. Their trees from Glenview are all over the area that this landscape nursery provided. So he bought all this property that ultimately was Swainwood, and then Swainwood was developed right after World War II. And then he went across what is now Lake Street, and he bought all the property where that big Scott Forsman development is, where right behind there's a general board of the Methodist Church.
Well, this is a big chunk of Glenview.
Sure. Ultimately, it was at one point it was 300 acres. Glenview
historian Beverly Dawson shared with us her publication about Hangar 1.
I had a few items published. Probably the most interesting was in the publication called Historic Illinois, published by the Illinois State Historical Society. When Hangar 1, the old Hangar 1 at the base, was named to the National Register, I wrote an article detailing its history and how we came to nominate it for the National Register.
While some of our authors have written about local history and topics, many of our guests have traveled the world and lived abroad, bringing us the most precious gifts, their stories. Jack Hafferkamp wrote about Central America.
Governments desperate for money with natural resources, trying to figure out how to bring money into the country, realize that tourism is often the way to go. But the problem with tourism is tourists come.
Yes.
and tourists change things. Tourists change things. I mean, have you ever had the experience of being in some place that you're not familiar with and somebody has provided you a service? Do you tip them? Is that expected? Well, one of the results of Americans going places is that people now have learned to put their hand out and say, oh yeah, give me a tip. Because they've learned that, well, if you stick your hand out, you may well get something. So might as well.
Yes.
And that changes the nature of a relationship, I think.
Mary Jo McMillan shared her experiences while living in Tanzania.
I received a package from my mother that contained 200 of these letters that I had written in the early 1960s on a little portable typewriter that I had taken with me to East Africa when my husband and I were on a project called Teachers for East Africa.
And this was before the Peace Corps.
This was before the Peace Corps. This preceded the Peace Corps, and but we were sent to work in the local schools, and
sounds like such an adventure.
It was an adventure. We were in the most remote posting that anyone could come to. So I wrote about what we did every day and how we lived and what we ate and what we saw and our schoolboys and our friends, and it was quite an experience.
Reverend Hansen about going to Ethiopia.
You know, we each have a worldview. It's kind of like colored glasses, you know, like sunglasses through which we see the world. And different cultures have different sets of glasses.
True.
And so we moved to a place, and so we had to take off our Western American glasses and put on a whole different set of glasses. And we were surrounded by people, many of whom were poor. Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's also the second largest, most populated country in Africa.
Okay.
And so we lived in a very urbanized, very populated, very poor country. And that helped me, particularly then when I had a chance to get to know all these students. And one of the things I did is I took each of my students out for tea before class. And so I would have 60 or 70 students in a semester, so that kept me busy. So 2 or 3 times a week I would be taking a student out for tea and getting to know them personally, just talking the way you and I are.
Oh, one by one, you
One
mean?
by one,
Oh.
yes.
Chuck Lobaca about occupied France.
The research is fascinating. It's like taking a history lesson. I mean, if I was at a cocktail party, I could have all kinds of stories about what happened back then. I'm not sure anybody's interested at this point in old history, but it was a learning process. And again, these are things that happened that I never knew growing up. We weren't taught in school. And in fact, much of what the French did in collaborating with the Germans was really not recognized by the French. They ignored it, they buried it for years and years and years. So it was really only until fairly recent past that people began to dig into this and things were published, records were finally released. So the full story is pretty much unfolded at this point as to what happened then. So I'm looking back, but I'm setting my characters into the situation that existed during those years. Basically, the book is basically 1938 to 1943.
Steve Richards about World War II Germany.
I learned many things, and the story, in essence, in a very simple way, is that in 1930, a young boy was born. His name was Heinz, and 14 months later, his brother was born. His name is Kurt, and Kurt is the father of my friend. And what we learned is that 14 days before the birth of Heinz, the older brother, the parents married, and the mother was an Orthodox Jew, and the father was a Protestant. And the marriage and the birth of these boys took place in a town called Karlsruhe, Germany. And for location, it's in the southwestern corner of Germany near France, and very close to France. And the fulcrum to the story that sort of brought me into it was that the biological father of the boys was a Nazi brown shirt. And as important as that is within the story, it became less important because tragically what ends up happening is that Kurt, the younger brother at his birth, ends up staying with his mother and eventually moves in with the Orthodox Jewish side of the family in this town. The older brother ends up moving in with the paternal grandparents, or the Christian side. And they lived next door to each other essentially for the next 9 years, not knowing of each other. And it's one of the many tragedies within this book. So if you can imagine, they had to have passed each other, maybe even talked to each other, but didn't realize who they were relative to each other. And then in October of 1940, Kurt becomes the part of the first mass deportation of German Jews. And that's important to draw the distinction. These are not just Jews, these are German citizens. Yes. And he and his family and about 6,500 Jews in the area are taken to a camp in southwestern France called Camp de Gurs, and he begins a Holocaust experience.
Emmerich Kohler about his immigrant childhood.
You know, I'm an immigrant family.
Yes.
I came from an immigrant family. We came to the United States in 1960. And after we've been refugees in Austria for 4 years, we escaped Hungary in 1956 after the revolution there. And so we arrived here in the States. And so we were strangers in a strange land, as it were. And we found security and comfort in getting together every Sunday at Mom and Dad's house. So first just the siblings, and then they had families, and every Sunday we would gather at Mom and Dad's place, first in Hyde Park, and then later on in Des Plaines when they bought a house there. And what would we talk about? Of course, old days. How was it? All the experiences from World War II to our immigration in America. Yes. lots of interesting stories. And the question came up after I retired, this should really be written down. It would be a shame if all of this would get lost.
Yes.
And then Anne came into the picture, my wife.
Yeah.
And when she found out about my background, she strongly urged me to write, if not for the whole world, then for the family and grandchildren, children.
Yes, yes.
And that was really the original intent. I never thought that my book would travel to Austria in a translated version or anything like
exciting.
that. But
Yeah.
just for a little, something that would be passed around in the family.
Jay Emberg about his life in Turkey.
I lived in a city, Izmir, which is right on the Aegean Sea. In fact, the apartment I lived in looked out over the Aegean Sea, and the area and the people both I just fell in love with. I spent 3 years teaching there, teaching teachers, as I said, to teach English, and the place just got to me again, and the story came out of the place.
Dr. Terence Dolan, who shared the story of how he was invited to work in Saudi Arabia.
And this woman said, well, the person who's calling is the King of Saudi Arabia. And I almost fell off my chair. In fact, I dropped several of the exams. And I said, good gravy, what does this person want me to do? And she said, well, you'll have to have them tell you, but if you'll go over there for a few days, they want to show you their situation. I went over there, and I met the king, I met his son, and I met perhaps a dozen of the princes. And we had a series of meetings, and they told me the following story, which in fact was a very interesting story. At that time, most of the world had programs called newborn screening programs. Well, it was one of the few countries on earth that didn't have a national pediatric program, so that a lot of these diseases, not only did they not know what they were if they did have a screening program, but they didn't know what the cures for these diseases were.
So you were asked to start this program.
So they were asked me to start the newborn screening program and to start a national research center on diseases in children and toddlers.
Shamsa Ismaili told us about her only in America moment from Pakistan.
When I was growing up, I mean, once you got married, you're done. There is no more going back to school.
Right.
It's for young kids.
Yes.
Not for women, not for women that are married with children.
Yes.
In this country, education has no age limit. When I was in class, I thought I would be the oldest one in the classroom, but that's not true. There are people that were much older than me, and they were there to get an education just like me. So, why not make the best of the opportunity that has been provided?
Sungju Ma shared the difficulty of explaining to an illustrator a Chinese toy in her picture book.
Yeah, my illustrator, she was an American lady, so of course she never played this game before. So she did like a car tire, really thick. And I said, no, that's not what it is.
No.
So luckily, in 2014 summer, I went to China. I saw this game. Then I bought two, and my daughter loved it so much. We bought two and bring back to here. They play here in our, driveway yard. So I took a picture and I played this and took a picture to show her what it looks like, how she will play.
Right.
And then she got the idea and she cracked, just this picture. So it's become like today.
Yeah, very interesting, because how do you explain that, without pictures, right? Dr. Amira Studio Gills shared her experiences while in the Philippines.
I have been to places that I'm not even allowed to talk about because how I got there is an issue.
You mean,
It's
okay.
yeah, the Philippines is a dangerous place.
Security, okay.
Security,
issue.
especially the south, where there is a lot of conflict in the southern part, and so I have very well-connected friends who are brave and have the
You're
resources.
brave to go yourself, right?
Well, and our thinking is if nobody else will do it, then who
Yes,
will?
who will,
Then these
yes.
species will disappear. Then nobody will find out about these communities.
Yes.
I guess the anthropology part is I'm very interested in indigenous cultures
Yes.
as well, which are
And
also
they're very isolated, are these
Yes.
communities, right? So they're not, I don't know, can you get there by motorcycle, or is this kind of a hike?
Everything.
Boat,
I've written every mode of transportation, little boats, small boats.
And you're not afraid of camping and
No.
ticks or
No, I come well
spiders.
prepared. Right.
You're okay.
Yeah, and and a lot of my friends are surprised
Right,
because
yeah.
this was not my background.
Yeah.
Right. I'm really a corporate person.
Yeah, usually not thrown into an environment where there's possibly scorpions and snakes. Or...
Right, and also a woman.
Carol Freeman wrote about capturing some of the endangered beauty right here in Glenview.
There are 483 or so endangered species in Illinois, and that number changes every 5 years as the list is reviewed. Some species come off the list, some species go on the list. But when I started, it was 483. So that's the number I quote. It's a huge number. And I photographed about 160 so far.
Wow.
Yeah, I live right near the Techny Basin, which is a birding hotspot, and I've actually photographed several of the endangered birds right there at the Techny Basin and at Air Station Prairie. So
and how about the grove or the
absolutely
forest trails? Or
the grove has some great birding and plants, and also along the river, all along the river, the West Fork, the North Branch of the Chicago River has some great birding. And Lake Glenview, there's been some rarities showing up at Lake Glenview. Even Lake Glenview. It's amazing because of all the wonderful native plants that are around the edge.
And prairie restorations, right?
Restoration efforts, and they've stocked it with native fish, and it attracts a wonderful amount of wildlife.
Wow. Our neighborhood writers wrote about the generation before them and for the generation after them. Two of our neighborhood writers wrote about the experiences of their families during World War II. Peter Stamatis wrote of his father's childhood in occupied Greece in Dandelions for Dinner.
When the Italians moved into the city of about 9,000 people there, they chose the neighborhoods. They went around and they took a survey of the neighborhoods and which areas they will put about 600 to 700 Italian soldiers. Okay? And they knocked at our door and they looked over the house, you know, several bedrooms. We had 1, 2, 3 bedrooms, a dining room and big kitchen and all that. And he says, 4 people in this room, in this house, it's not allowed. Yes. Half of your house is ours. And they use the main entrance to enter, and we nail the doors in between the front of the house and the rear of the house, so we have no communications with them. And we use the rear door as our means of entering and exiting.
Peter Grable wrote about his uncle's stolen wedding in Nothing in Hell.
He knew at some point they were going to get shipped off.
They didn't know when.
Didn't know when.
Yeah, because this 18 months is afterwards, you know, right, at the time.
And he had just met my aunt, who's this fiery little redhead. He had met her at a dance, and they were dating before he enlisted in the war. So he went off to go get trained, and he's like, you know.
She's in Chicago.
She's in
right?
Chicago.
Yeah, she's in home.
Yeah, and he's thinking to himself, wait a minute, I'm hearing rumors that we're going to get shipped out. He's seeing a lot of activity around the camp, a lot more equipment, a lot more stuff that looks like, hey, we're going to get deployed. So he sends my aunt a telegraph saying, I want to get married. And she got the telegraph and she's like, yeah, I want to marry you too. So in her head, she's thinking, all right, after the war, a year from now, 2 years, let's plan this out. And at the end of it, it's like, in 2 weeks. She was floored. She's like, in 2 weeks, why? And he wouldn't say why. He just said, we got to get
possible.
Yeah. So they pulled it off. They pulled off this wedding in 2 weeks.
Danielle Onesco wrote for her children in Wisdom in Creation.
Beauty that a lot of us just take for granted. You know, an example of that is the firefly, the firefly's light. You know, I talk about how it's a language of God's glory and wisdom, and you know, how there is a, I mean, I don't talk about this in my book, but just, you know, to study, I studied on the side the firefly.
Yes.
And just the chemical reaction in the abdomen of the firefly, breathing in oxygen, and then it transforms into that, you know, a bioluminescence in the abdomen, and that's what creates that light. It truly is a amazing, fascinating thing that you know, as some adults just, oh, there's a firefly. You know, but to children, it's like, wow, look at this.
Rich GAUSSELIN wrote for his grandchildren in his series of How the Grandmas and Grandpas Saved Christmas.
Basically, the series is like a sitcom. It's the same place, the same time, the same characters. The only thing that changes is the problem. In book one, the problem was the elves did not listen to Mrs. Claus, who she said, you know, wear boots, hats, gloves, etc. They go out and play a game of snowball, which is like baseball, except it's played with icicles as bats and snowballs as balls. And a storm came up. They got sick a week before Christmas in the final push, and their toys are yet to be made.
And they are stuck with a deadline.
And they're sick because they didn't listen to Mrs. Claus. Santa tries to build the toys. He says, I just can't do it. And then Joe, his retired supervisor, said, hey, grandmas and grandpas are kids. Let's call them and see if they can help.
While many of our authors wrote about their own experiences, their stories taught me more about myself than I ever could discover on my own. Dr. David Dean Brockman talked about dealing with the death of a parent.
That the earlier writings needed to be addressed to see if there was any evidence of his mourning the losses that he had suffered. And the reason that I picked that up was because I had been a member of a research group at the Institute for Psychoanalysis on parent loss and the result, the residua of losing a parent in childhood. And what we discovered in that research was that people tend to be fixated at the time of the loss. And
that takes a long period to grieve for this loss.
That is correct. In fact, they do not know how to grieve.
Marguerite O'Connor, a celebrant for the end of life, gave us Grief Struck and told us about legacy letters.
So one of the courses that I love to teach is called Legacy Letters, or also known as Ethical Wills. And this is a concept where you don't wait until the person dies to tell them how they had a positive imprint in your life. You can call them on the phone or text them or write them a handwritten letter, email, whatever form of communication you use, but it's very important to just let people know. So I not only enjoy teaching this class, I practice what I preach. So I was sending out some holiday cards in December, and I was thinking of one of my former employers, and on his holiday card, I just wrote maybe 5 sentences. But those 5 sentences, they meant a lot to him. So when he received the card, he called me. I was visiting my sister in Santa Fe, and he said, "Oh, honey, I just received your card, and I'm very moved by this." And it only took me a few minutes. That's the point. It only took me a few minutes to reflect and tell him why he was a wonderful employer who imprinted my life in many ways. He had also been one of my instructors at Loyola University. So again, these are small thing on our part, but it can mean a lot to the person who's receiving.
Elizabeth Antonucci suffered a near fatal accident and wrote fractured to overcome her internal and external injuries.
A lot of women have responded to my book very strongly, as well as a lot of men, surprisingly to me, because it talks about so many different topics that cross gender lines as well.
Right.
I think the most important thing I want readers to get out of my book is to get out of that good girl mentality, for men or women, that they don't have to be people pleasers, that they are enough, that wherever you are in life, you're enough, and you're doing enough, and you are who you are.
Our last guest collected stories and experiences from those very few and fortunate who traveled on NASA's Apollo 8 mission to the moon.
For Apollo 8 was Frank Borman. He was the commander of Apollo 8. Jim Lovell and Bill Anders. Well, Jim Lovell we know from Apollo 13, where there was a dramatic movie made where Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell. But Jim Lovell also was on Apollo 8. And he happens to live only about 15 or 20 minutes from my home. So that was another lucky break for me. So once I contacted him and he invited me to come over, then he put me in touch with the other astronauts and I was off to the races. So I could go spend time with them at their homes and really get to know them and to really learn this story on a very personal level in addition to a technical level.
What I learned from Glenview TV's off-the-shelf authors is the generosity of the human spirit. It is plain to see from our first 100 episodes that Glenview residents demonstrate openness and willingness to learn about one another. Stay curious, Glenview. This is the Glenview tradition that we plan to continue highlighting in the next 100 episodes. Thanks to the volunteers who helped out, and thanks to village staff Emily Lopez and Tim Davidson for putting in all the behind-the-scenes hours. Thank you for watching. Join me next time on Off the Shelf.